need to talk about something interesting.
Well, we're about to enter the roaring 20s soon, and I feel that's as good as an excuse as any to make superlative lists, but if you want a better reason, I often feel the need to evangelize for good anime. I've tried as a small-time anime tuber slash memer to highlight a few great anime series and movies that have succeeded in what they set out to do. But whether it's hours spent explaining every shot in my favorite films, or a quick hit on the themes in a legendary episode or scene, I'm always wishing I had more support. In fact, I've had use of a pointed and explanatory video-based recommendation list that I could just hand to someone wrapped up with a nice little bow and say, here are my reasons and my takes and what made me affected by this narrative. You can accept it, you can refute it, but you can't ignore it or say it doesn't exist. That is my impetus for making a video in which I could detail my 10 favorite anime series of the last 10 years. Some allowances. First, of course, I didn't watch everything over the last 10 years. In fact, I specifically avoided things that I knew I wouldn't like. But I did look at most of all of them. And even those that I spent an episode on passed a lot of scrutiny. And certainly I've checked out anything that could possibly come close to being what I would consider the best of the decade. And you can skip to the list if you want. I'll put a timestamp down there, but some talk on metrics. You know, writing plot stuff is easy. Writing themes or character motivations is harder. Writing plot stuff that meaningfully engages, enables, and explores themes or character motivations logically is quite difficult. Some of my favorite episodes of any anime are when the confluence of the plot allows the show to place the characters in very ambiguous situations where their mettle is then tested. The joy I derive from fiction and from life in general is seeing how and why these people choose to do what they do, and then seeing them face the consequences of their decisions. That's it. And while there are some other things that I appreciate to some lesser degree, like originality, uniqueness, efficacy, and visually conveying these choices and emotions, the primary reason I'm here is to see what the characters do when challenged, and to see how that says something transcendent or poignant about life or the human condition. An anime series is too large a collective effort to waste on superficial things. Why would you ever take all the time and money and love to create a piece of art and not infuse it with the max amount of passion and meaning? It's better to not have made anything at all than to make a hollow shell. That said, I'm afraid the following list will almost be entirely devoid of any allowance towards sakuga, visceral reactions, hype, or anything really that coincides with how people find value in a shonen battle show. And frankly, good. I hope to sweet Jesus and Madoka alike that more people find out that anime is a medium and not a genre. I hope that people who can enjoy Spice and Wolf and After the Rain are able to do so without ever having to sniff Attack on Titan or My Hero Academia. I hope crazy shit like Thunderbolt Fantasy or Pop Team Epic continues to get made, and I hope that they can find an audience without that audience having to pay their respects at the altar of Dragon Ball Z or One Piece. The value of animation as a narrative medium in the West lives or dies based on perception. And perception is something that I'd love to enjoy trying to change away from just kids shows, Family Guy, and Battle Shonen. It's, how we say, an aspirational goal, but hey. So before we get into the list, let's do some fun things. Let's hit some quick superlatives. Worst show of the decade. Personally, to me, Sailor Moon Crystal. There were a number of terrible Magical Girl shows over the past 10 years. Magical Girl Raising Project, Magical Girl Sight, things along those lines. Few, though, had the level of disregard for the core aspects of what made Magical Girl shows good as Sailor Moon Crystal. Crystal did nothing but confirm that Naoko Takeuchi has no fucking idea what makes a good story. Though that should have already been evident if you've read the original manga. The only reason this intellectual property has been so successful is the love and purpose that was infused to the original series by the original Toei staff, including Junichi Sato and Kunihiko Ikahara. I actually have an entire video on this, if you want to know more. But hey, at least we got Sailor Stars dubbed this decade. Objectively, though, the worst show that aired this decade is none other than Handshakers. For this one, though, I'll point you over to Nino's fantastic video on the subject. I don't think there's a single person who watched even a little bit of this show who can make an argument against it as a holistic failure at anything and everything. Let's go a little more positive. Movie of the decade. The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya. It's unfortunate that movies and shorts sometimes get dismissed in these lists. I think Disappearance would probably top this list if you put it head-to-head against other series. It's that good. Luckily, I've done all the work to explain why already. You can find my 6+ hour playlist and eulogy video for Kyoto Animation below. Shoutouts to both Your Name and Promare, my runners-up. Short of the decade. Hooling Babies. I had wanted to place Space Patrol Luluco and Inferno Cop here. The smoothness of those two reinforced my speculation that series composition and planning at Trigger are the true failings of the studio. When the plot is simple enough to be obvious or unimportant enough to be ignored, true creativity can shine. But instead I want to talk about a smaller show that you likely haven't seen. Hooling Babies is a complete gem of independent art, made by only 4 people and springboarding some up-and-coming voice actors. The surreal and abstract style of this show beguiles a very heartfelt tale. Come for the originality, but stay for the girls and their bonds. And now a list of very quick honorable mentions. SSSS Gridman. Trigger's best work, and it's not even Imaishi or Yoshinari. The craftsmanship in the directing and in the viscerality of the action scenes cannot be overstated. Scum's Wish. Awesome, realistic exploration of pretty people finding out what love actually isn't. Super thematically strong and heartfelt. Shirobako. A beyond endearing look at the effort it takes to get anime actually made. A touch idyllic maybe, but there's often a measure of unmatched realism when the people who make art talk about the process of making art. O maidens in your savage season. In a decade full of standout shows from female creators that really showcase a feminine perspective, Mari Okada's latest work about redefining identity through and in spite of sexuality stands out even in some great company. Hugto Precure. Some brilliant episodes and showcasing that classic Sato touch. The second best Precure to air this decade is reminiscent of the genre's best moments. It's got a cute baby too. Zombieland Saga. While the Zombie Idols was a cute enough twist to get everybody on board, it was clear that the love and care put in by the people at MAPPA elevated what could have been a gimmicky idol fare to must-watch territory. Land of the Lustrous. A very simple character study. Very succinctly, Fos loses her innocence and becomes unrecognizable. The main voice actor performance and the best anime CGI of all time are really just kickers to a delicious character meal. One Punch Man. A fantastic exploration of what makes hero stories worth telling. Sure, the animation is amazing, but it's the writing and characters that truly grabbed me. And so with no further ado and no more gilding of the lily, let us talk about the top 10 anime of the decade of the 2010s. Number 10, Flowers of Evil. Flowers of Evil is ugly. It's fucking terribly ugly. The first and most prominent feature of Flowers of Evil is the rotoscoped look, that the team actually went out and shot real-life actors and human beings in the real world, and then drew over them later. It's a very unique and unsettling art style choice, not one you see very often, and people in the West might remember from A Scanner Darkly with Keanu Reeves. But it is just that, a choice, and an informed one too. And I'm not even referencing anything here. We literally had the opportunity to speak with the director Hiroshi Nagahama at Otakon in 2019. Among his many stories, he explicitly said he only signed on to do Flowers of Evil if he was allowed to do it rotoscoped. The reasons, I think, are very clear to anyone who's watched the show. There's a large theme about tearing down appearances, accepting things as they really are, and how dirty and grimy it is when you leave the fantasies that are in your head, how nobody's perfect, and how to live life honestly without any falsehoods. It's a grimy and powerful message that is further enforced by the visuals of the show. And the simple gall you have to make that call in an era where wish fulfillment power fantasies are the main sellers and movers and popular shows, in a decade that canonized the isekai as what everybody wants. That alone demands a level of respect in the artistry. Sacrificing popularity for art? That's amazing. And what's more, it's not just the visuals compound upon the themes. It's an inherently negative show. It's one that's deliberately designed to invoke negative emotions from people and make people feel bad. And the problem with this as your conceit for your art is that most people aren't receptive to that. And the efficacy by which the show puts off people only adds further to the show limiting its own potential audience. And that's sad, I think, because the characters here and what the show wants to talk about are some of the most poignant and most fleshed out of the entire decade. While the spineless Kasuga is hard to watch, he's incredibly relatable for someone who has committed a big sin and is agonizing about it. And this is coupled with the manipulative Nakamura, whose kind of anti-society message is pretty easy to see through as a bit of loneliness and outsider rebellion against established norms. But here's the thing, the show, to its credit, doesn't embrace Nakamura's message of everything's ugly underneath and, that's the truth and that's real. Instead, it's made pretty clear that she's full of just as much bullshit as everyone else is, and that's not the truth and not the answer, and I think she even knows that. So Flowers of Evil ends up being this beautiful dance of these two incomplete people, neither of whom has the right of it. Kasuga with his flaw of guilt keeping him from his idyllic life, and Nakamura as her jealousy necessitates that she deprive others of happiness. And by the end, the show has torn down all of their worldviews, shown how errant their thinking was. When Kasuga's self-loathing and Nakamura's victimization have kind of run their course, after all the falsehoods about living life have disappeared, the show ends up coming across something true and honest about who we are and how we perceive others and ourselves. And it does so in a way that only a skillful hand and a uniquely negative show would be able to. If you want something different, or you appreciated the negative emotions from things like School Days or Neon Genesis Evangelion or Scum's Wish, I highly recommend Flowers of Evil, a show that I never ever want to rewatch, but I gladly will. 9. Panty and Stocking with Garter Belt. One of my absolute favorite things in life is irreverence. No ability in our lives is more singularly important to any human being than the ability to laugh things off and to hold nothing sacred. It destroys pride and exposes truth. It humbles us. And if the overly serious drama of something like Flowers of Evil is not your style, but you still want to come across something transgressive and with the ambitious intent to kind of tear down a social attitude, then the mocking, offensive irreverence and comedy of Studio Trigger's first show or Gainax's last show cannot be touched. The story goes that Hiroyuki Imaishi and the rest of the staff that made Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann were on vacation after finishing that show, and one night during their drunken reverie, they came up with the idea of parodying American animation. That came to life in 2010 with the story of two crass angels, the sex-obsessed Panty Anarchy and her sister, the food-obsessed Stocking Anarchy, and their quest to get back into heaven. While it does end up having a surprising amount of heart in the last bit of the show, Panty and Stocking is much more a showcase for ideas, in much the same way as a space dandy. This show entertains, and comfortably I might add, a Saving Private Ryan-esque masturbation episode, a zombie horror parody episode, an anime music video, and many more, all while insulting everything from David Lynch to High School Musical to Tom Cruise to the Catholic Church, and all while looking like the Powerpuff Girls. There's all that manic energy there, the desire to push past the boundaries of simple anime to make something that is offensive or shocks people out of what they think things could be. It's an anime made for the shits and giggles, and a type of unbridled creativity that rarely gets funded. Indeed, there's more than one direct line from Panty and Stocking's boundary pushing into the creation of Trigger and the aggressive theming of something like Kill la Kill. It is unrepentant, it's unique, And what's more than that, it's actually very funny, too. One of the other surprising wins for the show is that it boasts one of the best English dubs ever recorded, and one that is actually, by virtue of the languages themselves, better than the original Japanese, since it is parodying Western animation so hard, and because the show features a number of Western culture references, and because the show is so deliberately crass that they have to borrow English curse words because there are no curse words that function in the same way in Japanese. The show is uniquely set up to have a successful English dub, and Funimation absolutely did not disappoint. Most of the script is just a general outline with ad-libs from Jamie Marchi and Monica Rial over the entire thing. So as a result, there are references, jokes, and ad-libs that only work in English and are only present in the English dub. And if you have any knowledge of Japanese at all, I encourage you to go back and listen to the raw or the subtitled tracks and see for yourself how much funnier and better the show is overall, how much more the characters are expressive in the English version than the Japanese. So much of the comedic timing and directing prowess that would come to identify Trigger as a studio is present here, and the show boasts such a captivating style and content that I feel comfortable recommending this show to anyone who can say the word fuck. Anyone who understands the irreverent style of humor, anyone who's a fan of Imaishi or Studio Trigger, and most of all, anyone who does not have their panties in a bunch. 8. Heart Catch Pretty Cure. Lest you think this whole list was going to be avant-garde and not commercial anime, I'm here to tell you that one of the best shows of the decade somehow spawned from the mass production facilities of Toei Animation, and is an unrepentant cash grab to try and convince little girls that they need plastic toys. There is no expectation nor any reason why the 7th in a series that was specifically and explicitly created in order to recapture the same market as Sailor Moon and Magical Do-Re-Mi should be at all able to be something that could be enjoyed by all ages, or something that would have some of the best episodic writing, situations, or character development out of any magical girl show of the decade. And yet here we are, and here I am telling you the story of history's weakest pretty cure, of Cure Moonlight and Blossom and the rest, is without a doubt the best example of the traditional magical girl formula at work. Better than Symphogear, better than Kill la Kill, better than Yuki Yuna, or the other Pretty Cure seasons. And I wish we could attribute this in some way or justify it away. And sure, yeah, Rie Matsumoto did the movie, and that's great, and it's a very good movie. But aside from that, there's no names to attach to Heart Catch Pretty Cure. In fact, most of the staff was more new and hadn't worked on a Pretty Cure before this. And perhaps that's why the singular thing I can say about Heart Catch Pretty Cure is that it's clear, so very clear, that somebody actually cared enough to make this show good. And funnily enough, this position kind of mirrors the main character of Tsubomi. No inherent talent, no clout to her name, just simple and honest passion and determination. And I guess that's one of the first, but certainly not anywhere near the last time that I would be reminded of Sailor Moon while watching this show. Sure, it's formulaic, and sure, there's a lot of misses along the line. This isn't the most concise you could possibly make a show like this. We'll get to that later on the list. But the show understands the values that it's going for. It understands how to create a situation that expounds upon these values, and it lets its characters breathe within those situations and really show their own agency and their own personalities. The reason the climaxes work in these shows is because the slice of life moments inform the bonds that the characters have. And nowhere in this decade can I show that to you better and present that to you in a more comprehensive and straightforward way than in Heart Catch Pretty Cure. One of the common complaints I heard about Madoka Magica was that we don't get the time to really understand the characters or know them. And yeah, that's true. I mean, we'll get to that later on, but this is where the traditional magical girl show flourishes and is grown. And I'm not sure what exactly it is, probably the episodic writing, the beautiful character designs and art animation that allows it to be so fluid and cartoony, the spot-on voice acting and wonderful direction all throughout. There's a video by Tyrano that I'd much rather you guys watch because it goes into further depth on everything about this show. I'll link it down below, go sub to his channel. But the fact remains that Heart Catch Pretty Cure is still the best representation of a traditional magical girl show that we received in this decade. It's highly recommended for not only genre fans, because genre fans have undoubtedly already seen it, but for anyone, literally anyone of any age. And my hope is that by spending time with this show, you could better understand both the surface level aesthetic appeal of a magical girl show, but also the underpinnings that make the entire genre not only functional, but interesting and good. I will always recommend it for that. 7. Hibike Euphonium. There is a lot of appeal for me in something very concise. When it comes to art specifically too, I think that I'm more willing to say that something that is entirely focused and effective at what it sets out to do is definitively better than the alternative. With maybe one exception, I don't think there's a more concise show over the decade, or a more purposeful or a more effective one than Hibike Euphonium. It's such a testament to the skill of the creators at Kyoto Animation that I, having never even been in a concert band or any type of band, having no touchstone here, would walk away from Kumiko's story and the rest of the band's story intimately familiar with the emotions that they're going through and completely understanding the message of the show. Frankly, I'm extremely glad that Hibike Euphonium exists at all, because it's basically what if you took the production values of something like a Hyoka or a Violet Evergarden, but then actually infused it with great writing and series composition. Hibike Euphonium is Kyoto Animation at its peak. Not only visually, I mean, everything looks so good. God, the backgrounds, the character design, leg memes, the fact that all the background characters that don't even have any speaking lines all have fully modeled designs. But it's also the fact that, and this will become a theme if it isn't already, they use these resources purposefully to the ends of conveying things to the viewer visually. Bloom light effects on a dark background and beautiful character animation are fine, but beautiful character animation and bloom effects on a dark background that are a reward intradiegetically for Kumiko opening up to Reina, that is something that can only be done in this narrative medium. That is something that can only be accomplished by a studio that has the production values and means to produce such high quality animation as KyoAni. That is only something that can be willed up and created by some people with enough vision and understanding of the story as you have at Kyoto Animation. It's something that deserves and needs to be celebrated because it's something that deserves and needs to be repeated. And again, much like its story and much like its protagonist, the themes and message of the show are directly related to its production. If I would capture it in a few words, it would be refinement and passion, or perhaps refinement of passion. The show makes use of the characters' differing levels of passions, ranging from disinterest and nonchalance to fierce burning desire to improve, to explore something a little bit broader and more interesting than just the motivation to get better at something. The show purposefully and adroitly attacks the group mentality surrounding something as large as a concert band, and how it necessarily has to be a group that operates on one mind and with one purpose to achieve anything noteworthy. And it's the mechanics of that, the way the writing in the show handles the interactions and the attitudes, that really lends this show the level of investment and believability that gives it the right to trade in such dramatic and emotional terms. So not only is it a really, really good story, not only is it an exceptionally well-made television show, and not just because the things that it wants to talk about are impactful and meaningful to anyone's lives, anyone who interacts with other human beings or has a desire to improve or pursue any type of goal, because it's all of those things in a very tight package, all wrapped up with a bow on top, that I'm able to recommend Hibike Euphonium to literally anyone. Also, Season 2 is maybe not as good, but it did have those baller t-shirts. 6. As the Moon, So Beautiful. I have been and will likely always be a romance fan, but certainly not so in kind of the traditional shoujo romance form. While I think that genre did have some really great examples over this decade, I'm not really partial to any of them. To me, they've always come across as disingenuous or not true to life. Instead, I always prefer the stories that are more centered on people finding out what love isn't, These specific type of relationship dramas where the characters stumble onto some truth, or maybe they don't. It's not so much about the destination, but rather the realization of the value of others. And this kind of thing doesn't necessarily have to be limited towards a, traditional romance setting of modern era, no fantasy, etc. But when it is so profoundly simple as just put these two confused characters front and center and let them work it out, that shows confidence. That means without the aid of any contrivances or terribly cliche choices or genre trappings or expository dialogue, these storytellers are going to sling me a tale to sell me on two characters honestly and earnestly falling in love. That's necessarily more difficult because true-to-life romance and the spectacle that begets an entertaining show are almost always at odds with each other. The hurdle of believability for a normal, real-world attraction relies on some ever-so-subtle things, of nonverbal dialogue, of extremely small instances. It's stuff that's so hard to follow, even the characters will often miss it. But Tsuki ga Kirei, or As the Moon's So Beautiful, takes that challenge. It embraces it and it excels for it. Better than any romance show this decade, better than any romance show since Toradora. I'm not even sure I watched an anime, to be honest. The realism factor was so high. I made a video when the show was airing about the nonverbal communication, showcasing a couple examples, and those extend all throughout the show. But this level of attention to detail extends even if you pull back a bit too. Throughout the series, Akane's initial characterization is that she's demure or shy. She of course has her little potato plushie that she needs. However, that's not actually the case or not true to her personality. Repeatedly throughout the show, in specifically her relationship with Kotaro, she initiates. Now, she certainly doesn't plan or contrive things in such a way. It's more that she has a clearer idea of what she should be doing and a clearer idea of what she wants or where she's headed. And I think the beautiful thing about Tsuki ga Kirei is we can easily see where that comes from. Her relationship with her older sister and her parents is substantially different than what Kotaro receives. It's not something that's inherently obvious, you certainly have to be looking for it, but it's this little dollop of writing that so well emphasizes what the show is going for in regards to how the characters make their decisions about their relationship. And for a show that has nothing else other than the believability of this romance, that's what sets this show head and shoulders above other romances. Of course, the show is more of a complete package too. I love the visual style with the harsh highlights and a washed out look to the show. There's some beautiful storyboarding and directing as well. I particularly love Akane jumping across a river first as Kotaro follows behind in the last episode. And everything from the soundtrack to the sound effects to the voice acting has the same level of care to it that you can find in the writing. You do have to actively watch this show, and you do have to open your heart to these feelings as well. But I will say that As the Moon's So Beautiful makes it entirely easy to do both. 5. Sound of the Sky. I'm glad I'm doing a recommendation list because it allows shows like Sound of the Sky, which many of you would overlook or pass by if you weren't recommended directly to you, to get a little justice. And I completely understand. One look at the character designs and you may think this to be a K-On! Ripoff. And yes, certainly the show has an aspect of moe, but instead of that angle, let me ask you this. So many anime are about apocalyptic scenarios or the destruction of everything that we know and love. What happens after the world has ended? How do you wake up and go throughout your day when you have nothing to fight for? When everything that you sought to protect and defend has already died? In a world that has nothing, no inherent meaning, no enemy to fight, no battles to wage, why go on? Why live? That sounds overly macabre, and maybe it is, but that's the sublime and ephemeral tone that Sound of the Sky puts forth. And of all the characters unique in their backstories and their views on the world, it asks this the most difficult of questions, and answers it. There are shades of Arya, shades of Evangelion, And yes, shades of Kaon, of the story of these girls in a remote European town. And though there is a bit of dissonance intentionally between the character designs and the tone of the show, Sound of the Sky rarely comes off as anything other than truly impassioned and informed. Perhaps the best example of this is the opening. The ending song for the show is a bubbly J-pop tune that features the characters running and smiling and lyrics about friendship. The opening is a severely melancholy Kalafina tune, whose visuals depict the characters in the works of Austrian painter Gustav Klimt. The ending, of course, was intended to be the opening, but the creators realized that wouldn't necessarily match the tone of the work they had created. This is not a military moe show, despite what comments on the internet may lead you to believe. Instead, it's something more, an amalgamation that doesn't neatly fit into any real category, aside from slice of life, I suppose. It's not based on any other work, or on anything in particular other than a research trip to Spain, and despite the story leaving it wide open for it, it never received enough attention to get a second season. It is an odd orphaned anime, episodic and heavily character-based, full of a rich world with an established culture, and characters with believable motivations, and interesting dilemmas. The unique heavy themes with a light tone, the unique setting and problems of how to cope, and the absolutely astounding soundtrack, all combined together to produce this gestalt that is so eminently enjoyable, so sadly fascinating, and so unique a story. It feels far too real. Like reading the experiences of people who have lived through trauma. In fact, what it reminds me more than anything of is a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. And like that book, I don't think it necessarily has a message. Not so much a codified message, only examples on how to live, on why to live. So if you're a fan of questions about purpose, or just very, very good music, and I absolutely recommend Sound of the Sky. 4. A Place Further Than the Universe. And it should come as little surprise to you that this list would continue with another passion project original character-driven drama about girls struggling to find their way in the world that probably shouldn't exist. A Place Further Than the Universe is the tale of 4 teenage girls going to Antarctica. While that premise is in and of itself very interesting and unique, it of course belies the actual conflict of the show, which is each of the 4 girls using the trip to Antarctica as a way to overcome situations that are holding them back. Again, I guess you label that as coming of age. I guess this is technically an adventure, but I feel those labels are inadequate. The story is about the inner conflicts of the girls, how their combined goal forces the relationships, how their external situations and their interactions with each other enable and foster them to be in a place where they can attack anything that limits them or they allow to have some control over them. Shirase, headstrong, willful, so powerful, is beholden to the memory of her mother. While this conflict gets the most weight over the course of the series, the other 3 girls don't lack for baggage that they learn to address over the course of the show. And each one is done with a level of tact and foresight that is almost staggering. Revelations in later episodes color the choices that happened earlier in the show. The situations presented provide the perfect opportunity for the characters' differences in worldviews and opinions to overlap and conflict, and from them to learn from each other in that way. And the dialogue and writing of the characters in general makes them pop out as some of the most interesting of the decade, even divorced from their adventure. And while that's really the core of the show, it would be nothing if the rest of the production values weren't so astounding. Even a place as desolate as Antarctica ends up feeling homely and inviting and beautiful. The show has a ton of thought put into it, specifically in the blocking, directing, storyboarding, using light and color, using motion and sound effects, even repeatedly using things like signage and background elements to further the girl's story. I feel like I could do a half-hour video on any of those things alone. And the one thing I did choose to highlight back when the show was airing was the reflective writing. how a character can be addressing one thing, but then that means something for the character that's actually speaking it, or for other characters that are listening to it. And the show is just filled again and again with examples of this kind of purposeful intent. It's powerful in a way that many people did not expect or see coming. A Place Further Than the Universe is one of those shows that influences people and that affects them. It is a show that shakes people to the core, makes them reflect on their lives, and gets them to change. Honestly, if Crunchyroll wasn't squatting on all the Western distribution rights, I would have already bought this show physically and sent it out to numerous people in my life that I know have struggled with the same issues that the girls go through. But even if you are forced to stream it from Crunchyroll, I would highly recommend A Place Further Than the Universe to anyone. I think that even 1 or 2 episodes in, you'll be able to see how much this show has to offer, how well constructed it is as a tale, and you'll undoubtedly find yourself reflecting on your own passions and stagnant behaviors that you would take for granted normally. And you'll be astonished at how well a work of fiction about 4 high school girls traveling to Antarctica can move you. 3. Nichijou. My Ordinary Life. I would try and give you a plot synopsis to kind of figure out what Nichijou is, but that wouldn't do much good. It's a sketch comedy show, and one that relies a lot on visuals and timing. Usually what will happen is something normal will happen and then it will be taken to an absurd level, provoking a reaction. But even this description so vastly undersells the greatness of the show that I can't help but feel it's dishonest here to even continue. Why Nichijou is on this list is because it is the best comedy show ever animated. Period, full stop, Western, this decade, Gintama, anything. Nichijou is a masterclass in joke-telling proficiency, in comedic timing, in punchline delivery, in the setup and visual execution of jokes. It is the only show that has ever had me literally rolling on the ground in laughter. We could absolutely go shot by shot and parse any of these jokes for the exact specifics of what makes something funny and when, and frankly, the show deserves that type of critical look into it. But that's another video for another time. What I'll say now though is no anime before or since has been better able to navigate 2 separate tones. The rambunctious comedy and hyper-exaggeration. In that aspect, it's the most perfect dance of well-timed and egregious situations. You'll be left wondering how Mai or Yuko will explode the status quo next. But on the other hand, there's a total honesty and a heartfelt, sanguine love. And that idea that, like, yes, this is how life really is, and it's beautiful because of it. That sentiment that, yes, maybe our everyday lives are, in fact, a series of miracles. And the way the show is able to function competently as this humor show, full of non sequiturs and absurdities, and then still using the same cast of characters with no real plot over the course of the 26 episodes, can somehow arrive at a cast of characters that you entirely feel for, that you relate to, that you get to know and value as people. How they can build and strengthen their relationships through a series of jokes. The skill by which Kyoto Animation goes about doing this, finishing off each episode with an ending song that is 100% heartfelt and not comedic in the slightest, and other such tricks. All of that is worth watching purely technically, even if you somehow manage to avoid having an emotional reaction to the characters and the situations, something that admittedly would be pretty hard to do. Nichijou is a show that I find affecting my mood positively every single time I watch an episode. And that feeling, the attachment to the show, it's memorable. What's more, even though it premiered in 2011, just now in 2019, after 8 years, the show received an English dub, and an utterly fantastic one at that. I find it hard to believe that there's a person alive who wouldn't laugh at this series. And because of that, and the recent re-release of the show in English, I feel confident recommending this to literally anyone. I know that every single time I rewatch an episode, I end up shouting its praises from every corner of the internet. If you need some happiness, you need some positivity, or you're looking to remember the people that passed away in the Kyoto Animation arson attack, I'd highly recommend you spend some time with Nichijou. 2. Penguin Drum. I'm always excited when somebody asks for dark anime. Mostly because I know that means they want some content that involves gore or abuse or something like that. But it gets me excited to slide into those comments and recommend what I think is the darkest anime I've ever seen. I recommend Penguin Drum every time because it's impossible to challenge it, as right from the very beginning of the show, the characters are literally talking about the inescapable burdens of fate. How they never had a chance and their lives were all worthless right from the very start. And the show never abandons that kind of melancholy and reinforces it right to the very end. Each of the characters struggles individually with the motivation to continue living, with purpose and morality and other such haughty things. It's a full-blown tragedy, and very sad that the simple togetherness that the family values more than anything else is not offered unto them, or comes at a high price. In that way, it's not only objectively morose, but also fits nicely into my dichotomy of grace versus glamour, and glamour denies these characters their simple grace. And this is where we come to the idea that Penguin Drum is the best realization of these values, since even before this decade started, and even before the last one. Having watched and studied and written about his history in all of his works, I can honestly tell you that Penguin Drum is the fullest realization of everything that Ikehara has been attempting to convey in media. And I think that if you look at Sarazan Mai and Yurikuma, the other works he produced this decade, you'll pretty quickly find that a lot of the style and story beats and characters are lifted straight from Penguin Drum. What's more, I do think that Penguin Drum's a better work than even the series of Utena, and I think that comes down to editing. While Utena is still very much attached to the episodic Monster of the Day Magical Girl formula, Penguin Drum has an editor. Just like the Utena movie, it contains all the great parts that made the show good, but it refines them and puts them together in a more logical and focused storytelling. Because of this, coupled with the style of the show and the surface-level humor of the penguins, I find this to be the most eminently watchable of all Ikehara shows. Motivations are clear and easy to follow. Kanba wants to save Himari, but he's willing to do anything. Shoma wants to do the same, but he has reservations. Ringo is beholden to the fate of the diary. Of course, there's very many twists and turns. There's a great deal of complicating glamour. But through all of it, even when it gets at its most complicated, everything is very clear. Kanba and Shoma and Himari have been denied, by the whims of fate, a simple and idyllic lifestyle. What will they do to retain it? It is a show that features absolutely top-class music, directing, style choices, comedy bits, and at times animation as well. But all of these are indeed just tools that Ikehara uses to attack these somber themes: prejudice, rejection, ostracization, and even more primal ones too, borrowed from Magical Girl canon. The value of compassion and understanding, how to encounter and deal with defeatist and hopeless attitudes. Among all stories that I saw this decade, I would say it is the one that is most deserving of being told. And I think that for anyone looking to cry, or anyone that has ever felt worthless, this show is a must-watch. Go in with an open mind and expecting nothing in particular, and I think you'll leave with a new outlook on life. 1. Puella Magi Madoka Magica. I'm honestly not sure what there is left to say about Madoka. Maybe just this. Puella Magi Madoka Magica is by far the most concise, effective, meaningful, and indeed best show released in the last 10 years. And frankly, for as much as I love the other shows on this list, it's not even close. I have spent the better part of this decade analyzing, breaking down, and explaining to others why this show is the paragon of everything a Magical Girl show can and should be. Of course, we've heaped on it a lot of praise for its subversive aspects, and yes, while those are a core part about the appeal of the show, and yes, while Gen Urobuchi's script delivers all the trauma you could possibly want, these elements by themselves don't make this number one on the list. The thing that I fought to show people over the course of this decade was how well this show works in the context of a magical girl genre piece. From obvious references to external callbacks to the themes of earlier works, to direct word of God interviews from Shinbo and the rest, to the fact that this show is simply more enjoyable when you have a background of belief in miracles and magic and Care Bear bullshit. Yes, we can and should spend a lot of time talking about the unmatched visual design, creating an otherworldly eldritch abomination world out of papercraft to contrast with Aoi Yuki's Hidamari sketch-esque wide-face character designs. And yes, we absolutely should harp on how well constructed the characters and their situations that challenge the characters are, and how perfectly paced the composition of the 12 episodes is. But all of these aspects are purposeful and intentful. Everything flows logically, and not a scene or a shot is ever wasted. The tiniest of details, from the backgrounds in the Witch's Labyrinths to the way the characters are named, they all inform and further the purposes of this show. One that is specifically written to draw upon the background knowledge of the genre that the viewers would have, and one that specifically relies on those expectations to poke at and say something meaningful about the value of the genre as a whole, to reaffirm it by challenging it. You cannot create Madoka Magica if you do not first create lyrical Nanoha. If you don't first understand why Cardcaptor Sakura or Sailor Moon's climaxes hit so hard, if you're not a fan of Princess Tutu or Pretty Cure, you're instead only gonna see this show by its outer face. And that's such a pity, because everything in the show feeds back to its heart. And when, after all the drama has played out and all the characters have acted their hour on the stage, and those words come up on the screen, and you see the affirmation of the core values that the show was trying to convey over the entire run, then you know that the story has done what it set out to do. Because of its limited scope, because of its awareness and intent, because of the uniquely specific and poignant message that it was going for. I have no choice but to say Madoka Magica was the best television show that I saw in the last 10 years. I highly recommend that everyone become a Magical Girl fan and then go into Madoka Magica and experience what I experienced. Because being emotionally manipulated in that way, because having your truths attacked and challenged and reaffirmed by a piece of media is such a rare and unique experience that it should be offered to and pursued by everyone. It's not something that you'll ever forget. And in the words of Christina V., Homura's voice actress,
Don't forget. Always, somewhere, someone is fighting for you. As long as you remember her, you are not alone.